Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, excellencies. Welcome to the Royal Irish Academy, to our meeting room. I'm Mary Canning, I'm President of the Academy, and we are delighted that so many people have joined us here today to discuss really one of the key important issues facing our society, and that is the future of higher education. We are particularly delighted that we will be receiving our keynote address from Professor Maria Leptin, President of the European Research Council, and from Professore Alberto Meloni, the Chief Scientific Advisor to the European Commission. The title is Exploration and Transformation, and I think everybody in this room is aware of the challenges facing higher education today. We are going to explore some themes through this conference and try and put a fresh outlook and a way of approaching higher education through a different lens. Transformation requires alteration, transitions to new thinking in technology, new methodologies, digital transformation, sometimes the ability to change and pivot very quickly, and of course to deal with disruption, which we are seeing right across our societies today, and of course especially in Europe at the moment. Transformation also addressing climate change, mitigation, sustainability, and this again needs to happen right around the world. I know that our panel on Going Green in Higher Education will be discussing these themes in the later afternoon. We have a wide range of expertise and knowledge with us here today, which is what the Academy is about, a convening space to discuss important issues in an independent fashion. We have 4 individual panel sessions assessing and considering everything from research assessment, the research landscape, research structures, evaluating leadership, and how universities can enhance creativity and lead on social progress. As many of you know, this conference is a continuation to the Higher Education Taskforce work on higher education in the island of Ireland, and this has been a seminal series of publications from the Academy. We have seen, therefore, that crisis requires society to renew itself, and the COVID-19 pandemic and Ukraine both are making us think differently about higher education, as well as the sustainability issues that I have mentioned. I wish you the best for a thought-provoking and innovative conference today, and I look forward to engaging with you on many of these discussions. It would not have been possible without Professor Gerry McKenna, Senior Vice President of the Academy, and I'm going to welcome Gerry to the stage now and thank Roisin Smith for all the work that she has done. Thank you very much, Gerry.
Well, thank you, President, and can I echo your words of how delighted we are to see such a large and varied group of delegates registered for today's, what we think is a very important conference. And as the President has said, the background to this was the establishment of the Higher Education Futures Taskforce in 2020 with the support of the President, and that was just at the beginning of the COVID lockdown, actually. And the intention was that the review, the activity should be representative of higher education stakeholders across the island. There were 37 members of the task force, more than probably we expected, because we didn't expect everybody to accept, but everybody who was asked to join the task force did, which I think reflects not just the standing of the Royal Irish Academy, but also the importance of the issues that we were seeking to address. And over 100 organizations, stakeholders, interested parties, and individuals representing the private, the public, and the third level sector made inputs and submissions. We established 5 subgroups. One was on values and vision, which the President has alluded to, the importance of the value of higher education, the values that it brings to a democratic society, and we've seen across the world where that can be undermined quite rapidly. The future landscape of higher education, the changing environment through globalization, issues of sustainability, etc., taking place. And of course, COVID itself brought major changes. The third subgroup related to the role of regions and place in higher education, and that's particularly important in the context of Ireland. The fourth was in relation to equality, diversity, and inclusion in higher education, also hugely and massively and essentially important. And the fifth related to research and innovation, reimagining how this would develop in the context of an all-island developments in higher education. The reports were produced in November 21, and they had significant impact, including, of course, one outcome is this conference today. Last month, we actually had a joint conference with the Hume Foundation in Derry, Londonderry, on the future development of higher education in the greater Northwest region, and there's more work to be done in relation to that. But we have a very exciting program ahead today, and it's an opportunity to explore major issues, allow for discussion and actions that might be taken forward in the future. The Royal Irish Academy provides a forum for such discussions. It's a neutral venue. It's without any agenda other than to support the development of the most effective, inclusive, and efficient values-based higher education system across the island of Ireland, and including, of course, its various regions. So we're very fortunate to have as our guest speaker, our keynote speaker this morning, Professor Maria Leptin, President of the European Research Council. Professor Leptin took office as President of the ERC on the 1st of November 2021. Prior to that, she served as Director of EMBO from 2010 to 2021. She also established a research group in Heidelberg at the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, and the group studies the mechanics of shape determination during development. In 1994, Maria became Professor of the Institute of Genetics at the University of Cologne in Germany, where she still leads a research group. She spent sabbaticals as a visiting professor at the École Normale Supérieure, Paris, in 2001, and as visiting scientist at the Wellcome Trust Sanger Institute, Hinxton in the UK, 2004 to 2005. Professor Leptin is an elected member of EMBO, the Academia Europaea, and the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina, and an honorary fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences. She's also a foreign member of the Royal Society since May of this year. And she's going to speak, as the President said, on the impact of reforming research assessment, which is something which is of great interest to all of us. And we're delighted that you're here, Maria, and we look forward to what you have to say. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here too in this amazing setting. It's awe-inspiring. What happens if I close this laptop? Should I put mine on top? Let me see if that works. It's still there? Okay, good. Dear Professor Canning, dear Professor McKenna, dear university rectors and colleagues, that's one of the nicest aspects of my job, that I sometimes get into the company of other academics whom I would otherwise not see. Thank you for inviting me to speak here at this important conference on the future of higher education. It's my first time as president of the ERC here in Ireland, and it's only my second time here at all. I'm embarrassed to admit. But I remember my first time fondly. It was in 2012 on the occasion of the ESOF meeting here in Dublin. So while I know the country only through photographs, movies, and its literature, I do have a good personal impression of the watering holes in Dublin. Nor is it the first time that the ERC has been to Ireland. Before I came here, the ERC staff were keen to tell me about the plenary meeting of the ERC Scientific Council, which took place in Dublin in October 2016. On that occasion, the Council had the great honour to be addressed in person by the President of Ireland, Michael Higgins. He argued passionately and eloquently against, quote, an unquestioning and narrowly defined utilitarianism, which is profoundly harmful to the practice of research. And I want to read you a bit of his speech because it describes the important aspects of assessment so well. He said, if we want to continue to nurture in Europe independent thinkers, adventurers, and questioning scholars, it is vital, I believe, that our research and educational institutions preserve themselves from any excessive emphasis on short-term outcomes and that which is measurable. Intellectual creativity is not quantifiable. It can never be fully or appropriately described in statistics, in the number of patents, publications, or even in the number of jobs, so very important to our citizens, that it might generate. Nor should knowledge acquisition and research training ever be assessed exclusively in terms of their effects on the wider economy and the labour market, however important such a focus may be. Science, education, training, these are processes and practices that have an intrinsic value, fostering as they do the development of such intangible life-enhancing skills as empathy, imagination, analytical thinking, patience, clarity in reasoning, as well as sheer curiosity. What a present. The speech made a great impression on all who were there at the night, and I think the words of President Higgins offer an excellent introduction to the subject of reforming research assessment, which I've been invited here to talk to you about. And of course, as we've heard, reforming research assessment is a very topical subject at the moment. Many people date the start of the current debate on research assessment to the San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA, which was made in 2012. Its aim was to ensure that scientific output is measured accurately and evaluated wisely by funding agencies, institutions that employ scientists, and by scientists themselves. It recommended in particular that journal-based metrics such as the journal impact factor, which were developed to assess journals, should not be used to assess researchers. There have already been changes over the past. For example, at EMBO, when I was its director, we introduced accepting preprints as evidence for applicants for fellowships. So rather than having to show that they had completely published papers, preprints were sufficient. This has now been, under the new director, been taken further, where refereed preprints can actually be included as full and valid parts of the CV, fully equivalent to papers in journals. And others have made similar changes, but this has all just been a first step. Yet others have developed this further, for example, the Wellcome Trust, as well as the UKRI, who've introduced narrative CVs as a way to allow researchers to include any achievements they deem important and not only publications in journals, and to explain their value in their own words, rather than in inappropriate metrics. So from a relatively simple start, the debate has broadened in recent years into a call for deeper reforms of all the ways in which research, researchers, and research institutions are assessed. Most of you will be aware that at the start of this year, the European Commission and others initiated a process to draft an agreement on reforming research assessment. The drafting team was made up of representatives from the European University Association, Science Europe, and the European Commission, and a number of other individuals with expertise in the area of research, on research. And a core group of 20 organizations, of which the ERC was one, also contributed to the drafting process. And then on the 8th of July, the final version of the agreement was presented at a stakeholder assembly of over 350 organizations from over 40 countries that had expressed an interest in being involved. And the final agreement was published on 20th of July. It includes principles, commitments, and a time frame for reforms, and lays out the principles for a coalition of organizations willing to work together in implementing these changes. And currently, funding organizations, research performing and organizations, and others are invited to sign up. And I assume some of your institutions may have done that. But for those not following this so closely, what's the issue? The Commission, in a report last year, about a year ago, motivated the need for reform in the following way, and I'll again quote, "Assessment of research quality and impact and of researchers' performance is fundamental to selecting research proposals to fund, to deciding which researchers to recruit, promote or reward, and identifying which research units and institutions to support. The research process is undergoing digital transformation, is becoming less linear and more collaborative and open, and more multidisciplinary with a larger diversity of outputs. At the same time, the current research assessment system often uses inappropriate and narrow methods to assess the quality, performance, and impact of research and researchers." So the debate about assessment has moved beyond a technical discussion related to the issue only of metrics to a broader range of thoughts. But let's remember that the subject and the idea of research assessment is not new, and it certainly predates DORA. And in fact, the tension between the desire of scholars to pursue knowledge freely and the desire of other interests, funders, or people in power in society to channel and oversee the work is as old as research itself. So let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. For one thing, assessment is a very broad term. The current public debate is mostly about people. How are the achievements of individuals assessed? This happens in many different contexts, as the statement I just read out says. It's about research institutions, recruitment of researchers, applications for grants or fellowships, prizes, and many other situations. But these assessments of individuals are intimately connected to higher order assessments. If a university is assessed by how many publications in high impact journals it produces or how many patents it produces, then of course the university will pass that criterion onto their own researchers. And so we can't look at assessment of researchers in isolation. And if we're asking about universities putting pressure on their researchers, we have to ask who puts pressure on the universities. The University of Bologna is often recognized as the first European university. It adopted an academic charter, the Constitutio Habita, in the 12th century, which guaranteed the right of traveling scholars to unhindered passage in the interests of education. So topical for today. Indeed, one of the main motivations for creating the early universities in Europe was to create knowledge communities which were independent from church and state. And we can see this dynamic play out over the centuries. For example, one of my own former institutions, the Max Planck Society, is proud to be based on the so-called Harnack principle, which is named after the first president of what was then called the Kaiser Wilhelm Society, which was established in 1911. Max Planck Institutes are built around their directors, leading researchers who, independently of anyone, define their own research subjects, build their own institutes, are given the best working institutions, and are free in deciding on their staff and recruitments, etc. But the tension between allowing scientific freedom of that type and imposing oversight really developed strongly after the Second World War. In many countries, the post-war period saw a massive increase in public research spending, as well as a huge increase in enrollment to higher education. Prior to the war, governments in many countries had little involvement in research and development, except maybe in fields like medicine and agriculture. And only a very small percentage of the population went to university. This changed with efforts made in military research and development during the war, with major breakthroughs such as the Manhattan Project, radar, cryptography, computers, rocket and jet engines, etc., as well as progress in medicine such as blood transfusion and mass-produced vaccines. So the post-war period, as I saw major R&D programs in defense, nuclear energy, space, as well as efforts to boost the competitiveness of national industries and to expand the skills of the workforce. And at the same time, new bodies for supporting basic research were created, such as the US National Science Foundation. But with this increased funding came a desire for increased oversight. By the 70s, there was a growing feeling in many policy circles that science could not simply be left to scientists. Science, and especially technology, should be harnessed to societal needs. Universities were beginning to be seen as too narrowly focused on traditional disciplines and in need of reform. The idea of the ivory tower as being undesirable became prevalent. Starting in the 1980s, the European Commission's framework programs began to make extensive use of assessment. Projects were assessed before the start, at the midterm, at the end of the project, and even 2 or 3 years after the end of the project. This led to a general notion of establishing baselines, deliverables, and tracking research progress and outcomes. So it was only a matter of time before universities started to feel the effects of this. Initially, most governments' grant awarding bodies only validated applications from principal investigators. Research support was sufficient to meet high-quality proposals, so assessment of wider outcomes was limited. The formal research assessment, which is now widespread in the university sector in some countries, was not always part of public funding. And I guess the first assessment of public sector research base, at least to my knowledge, was the UK's research selectivity exercise, or later named the research assessment exercise, makes some people quake in their boots, introduced by the University Grants Committee in 1986. This was linked to the trend of new public management, which sought to run public sector organizations using private sector practices in an attempt to increase efficiency. Other countries followed to a greater or lesser extent. Germany implemented some comprehensive evaluations across higher education, but did not adopt regular assessment cycles. Other countries, France, Czechia, Poland, have all explored and described possible research assessment, but then not proceeded to implementation. Netherlands and Sweden organized research assessment on an institutional level, but without funding implications. So the point is that we should not think of the current initiatives to reform assessment as something completely new, emerging from a set of unique challenges that are current. Rather, it's part of a long-running story of scientific freedom versus supervision by funders. Maybe the current movement to reform research assessment can even be seen as part of a backlash against a prolonged trend toward increasing oversight, quantification, and, to use Higgins' words again, narrowly defined utilitarianism. Why is that word so hard to pronounce? Maybe because we don't want it. There's some ironies, for example, that of all institutions, the European Commissions were the ones who introduced excessive assessment, and deliverables are now the ones who want to lead the current reform. So, current demands and pressures. I do agree that the university sector does feel under more pressure today than it did in the past. And also as individuals, as academics, we are now expected to split our time not only between research and teaching and administrations, but also to contribute to society more widely. So maybe it's no surprise then that in surveys, many academics say that they have less and less time for the actual research. In some cases, increasing obligations around teaching and administration crowd out research entirely during term time. And this is despite academics reporting longer working hours than ever in some cases, and in some cases burnout. And I'm describing the lucky ones who are actually in permanent positions. For researchers trying to start out on a career in academia, the picture can be very daunting, with many going from one short-term contract to another with no guarantee of long-term positions. In a similar way, when I look at the range of issues where universities are expected to take the lead, from digital and green transitions to open science, from European innovation ecosystems to values, it seems to me that the environment in which universities operate has become increasingly complex. And with all these responsibilities comes an associated burden of assessment and targets and monitoring. So can we say that these developments have improved the ability of Europe's universities to fulfill their core missions of teaching and research? This brings us back to the agreement on research assessment. Can it address some of these pressures? If you look at the researchment itself, I think it's rather well balanced. The vision it sets out is that, I quote, the assessment of researchers and research organizations recognizes the diverse outputs, practices, and activities that maximize the quality and impact of research. And to do this requires basing assessment primarily on qualitative judgment, for which peer review is central, supported by responsible use of quantitative indicators. So there's no desire to attempt lowering standards in research assessment, but the intention is probably the opposite. What the agreement questions is taking shortcuts for judging excellence, for example, by considering the journal impact factor or H indices, rather than researchers' contributions to knowledge or their research proposal. So let me talk a bit about the ERC. As you know, the ERC is based on a simple idea. We support the best researchers to work in Europe on their best ideas. And the sole criterion for selection is scientific excellence. This approach is critical, and we have no intention of changing it. It's been our clear strategy since the founding day of the ERC 15 years ago, after decades of efforts from the scientific community. At the heart of this approach is an unrelenting focus on the quality of our evaluations. I think I'm actually going to skip some of this because you know it. So the ERC's peer review evaluation process has been carefully designed to identify scientific excellence. It takes into account career breaks as well as unconventional career paths. The evaluations are constantly monitored to guarantee transparency, fairness, and impartiality. And open practices such as open access, depositing data and code in publicly accessible repositories is already mandated. So we're thus clearly committed to basing assessment primarily on qualitative judgment, for which peer review is central. But that does not mean we can be complacent. In my view, any organization that wishes to represent excellence must be permanently self-critical and must continuously evolve. And indeed, the ERC Scientific Council closely follows the current debate, and we've set up a task force on research assessment last year. And this task force is looking closely at the various proposals and recommendations for reform in the light of the ERC's own current practices. And as the chair of the task force, I've been very clear that we should not start from the position that the ERC's evaluation processes are untouchable or perfect. In my view, many of the demands being made in regard to research assessment, particularly from the younger generation, are legitimate. So we've tried to look at what's being proposed by others and to look at our own processes with an open mind. We've looked at how we define scientific excellence. We've looked at the guidance we provide to applicants and to panel members, what information we ask them to provide and in what form. We've looked at the various steps of our evaluation process and how our panels are briefed. So we're still in the midst of our deliberations, and we don't yet have final outcomes, but I'm hoping that the Scientific Council, which will meet in a couple of weeks, will come up with a good solution. We are proposing a number of changes, and most importantly, we will publish our deliberations. We will publish our thinking and the reasoning for the changes we've made and the reasoning for the criteria we're keeping, which is scientific excellence. But we will be having mechanisms for taking account other contributions that researchers made to the scientific community. But before I conclude, I want to say that reforming research assessment, while important, cannot solve all the problems of our universities or of research in Europe. Research assessment is related to allocating resources. But of course, this is of limited use if we have insufficient resources overall. And the question of how we assess does not really tell us what types of research to support. In 2000, the EU set itself the ambitious goal to become, by 2010, I quote, the most competitive and dynamic knowledge-based economy in the world, what's known as the Lisbon strategy. And one of the key planks of that strategy was to raise overall R&D investment in the EU to 3% of GDP. Unfortunately, 22 years later, the EU R&D investment is still far from its 3% target and below its major competitors. In 2020, China, the EU and USA had economies of comparable size, but the US continues to spend considerably more on R&D than the EU, with 3% of its GDP, followed by China with 2.2% and us with a measly 2.12%. So where are we with that lofty goal? So while European researchers and research institutions are still currently capable of producing world-class work, we see some of it here. This investment gap may make that unsustainable in the future. So technological progress relies on connected knowledge communities, people who understand the existing technologies and phenomena that underpin them. So European investment is not to try to create an autarkic European science. We need to be able to keep up with the scientific and technological frontier and not let it move too far ahead of us. Otherwise, in 2 decades, we will be lamenting Europe's position as a scientific follower, dependent on others for key technologies. And I see it as part of my role to make that clear to politicians. It's also important that the funding we do provide for research is not too short-sighted. To maintain a healthy research ecosystem, investing in long-term curiosity-driven research is indispensable. Firstly, we should never forget the message of President Higgins about the intrinsic value of science and education. And this includes, of course, subjects that are seen as ivory tower subjects, but are part of human curiosity, which is a value in itself. So even if we do try to measure the benefits of research, we should avoid a narrowly defined utilitarianism. One key consideration is that people go into research for the intellectual challenge. They have a sense of curiosity about the world. Their ambition is to work with leaders in their fields, to even create a new field of their own. This is another reason why defending scientific freedom is not naive. It is essential to ensure that research remains an attractive career for our brightest and most ambitious young people. We also need to understand that the channels by which frontier research feeds into the economy or makes an impact are many and diverse. It's not about X number of patents or spin-off companies. It's not even about the occasional breakthrough discovery. Basic research increases the stock of useful knowledge, both the kind which is written down, publications, monographs, exhibitions, expeditions, and the kind of that people carry around in their heads, skills, knowledge, and experience. We train skilled graduates and researchers in solving complex problems. We produce new scientific instruments and methodologies, create international peer networks for transmitting the latest knowledge, and we can even raise new questions about societal values and choices. This is the foundation upon which we can build our future. It's clear then, regardless of how we assess researchers, researchers must have the freedom to explore and understand the world as it is. Some consider this approach to be idealistic. I consider this approach to be pragmatic and necessary in order for science to have its maximum impact for the benefit of society. And while I'm the president of the ERC, I will continue to make this argument for as long as it takes to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Leptin, for that very informative and I think inspiring lecture. And I think what you had to say will be hugely well received by members of the Royal Irish Academy, where we also continue to evolve in terms of our assessment of excellence. But excellence is the primary criteria within the Academy. And research assessment, I think it is important that it is being looked at across Europe and that some common issues and standards are being developed. And I have to say what you have said is not hugely divergent from what has been developing in the UK as well. And it's fair to say that research assessment in the UK has actually greatly improved the quality of research in the university system by and large, without it requires modification from time to time. But I'm sure there are questions and comments that people will want to make to you. Dan.
Thank you very much for those remarks. I want to ask about a couple of things unrelated. One is the place of impact, and to the extent to which the ERC has to engage with impact or feels the pressure of an impact agenda. And the second one really relates to DORA and the implications that we have to evaluate research differently, and about the practical implications of the time necessary, for example, to read publications rather than to simply tabulate and base decisions on that. Thank you.
Okay, so the first was impact. Now, you know, EU lingo is not necessarily the same as academic lingo or vernacular. So impact, of course, can mean anything. If I discover something new about, I heard about language today, that's not going to solve climate change or give us the next vaccine, but it may have a huge impact on our thinking, on our understanding of our history, of our culture. I'm happy with that impact. And somebody who sits in their ivory tower and does something that is of no interest to anyone, let them do it, but it's less fun. So I'm happy with saying what we do should have impact. We want that for ourselves. We want to go to a conference and people come to our talk rather than to the parallel session because they think what we say has impact on them. So if I use that term, fine. If I use the term impact in the sense that, you know, an economic impact or solving societal problems, that's not the purpose of some of the research we do. So having said that, I have to say the taxpayer who pays us, after all, is entitled to have their money spent on solving problems. And we would be the last to say that our research isn't necessary to solve problems. So it is. But we don't know yet what part of our research will help. So that's, I mean, I'm preaching to the converted here, that you know this, but this, and fortunately, I mean, this is the tiny silver lining of the COVID crisis, is that politicians have recognized that. The COVID vaccine was not developed in half a year because somebody came top down and said, here's 20 billion, develop a vaccine. It's because of the research that was done, that was poo-pooed 20 years ago. So this has been helpful, and politicians are beginning to see that. So what I was going to get at is, yes, the taxpayer is entitled to think, is research useful? And I think we do need a collaboration between fundamental science and that part of research funding that brings this to market, to application. And I'm very glad that the EU actually funds that in the form of the European Innovation Council. And I had the great pleasure of sitting opposite Mark Ferguson over dinner last night, and we totally agree. We are totally on the same page with both being necessary. And there's, in fact, a very good relationship between the EIC and the ERC. We have a common committee. The EIC looks at ERC research to see who can be encouraged. The ERC makes it clear to their researchers that they can go to the EIC. And indeed, of the transition grants, 2/3 of the successful transition grantees are former ERC grant holders. So, you know, we know the pipeline exists, we feed it, but we must not assume that only that which has economical impact today is worth funding. DORA is interesting. I'm often asked, well, are we supposed to ignore where people publish? No, of course not. Of course not. Of course there are good publishers. Many of them are many scientific societies publish, not for profit. Some publishers, especially in my field, in the life sciences, it's very important that journals do good data curation, that they ensure that the researchers deposit their data in trusted databases. They manage the peer review process, which can be shoddy or which can be very good and critical. So, of course it matters in which journal you publish, but it doesn't necessarily matter how much you publish. It doesn't matter the impact factor. So the panels will have to look at the quality of the published output, and the quality of the journal is part of it. But it can't be measured in simple metrics.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring talk, and I'm delighted to hear your strong support for many of the values which I and ALIA, I should mention I'm one of the vice presidents of ALIA, the Federation of European Academies, which strongly supports this reform of research assessment. And speaking personally, I'm very pleased to see your strong support for the validity of preprints as good quality research outputs, particularly for grant evaluation. The one point I wanted to raise was, I mean, we should be reforming research assessment anyway, but we should also recognize that the perverse incentives built into the old system were incredibly destructive. And I'd like to ask you a little bit about the perverse incentives in the old system, particularly as they affected exploitation of early career researchers, predatory publishing, etc. So I think it'd be useful to hear your views on that. Thank you very much.
Okay, that's a hard one. I mean, predatory publishing, I've just mentioned, is, I find it astonishing that, well, maybe it's not astonishing. Young people, and also not so young, people who are not close to the publishing world can't possibly know all the ins and outs. And the Plan S and Coalition S, I think, did not do the world a great favor in pushing in a direction that undermines expensive, high-quality publishing with the pretense that open access cures all. So I think the open access movement is justified and is good, but one has to be honest that high quality activity costs money, no matter in what field. Perverse incentives. Yes, I mean, I heard from, who was it? Helmholtz Association in Germany. The president pointed out that the German Ethics Council, it's the highest, one of the highest bodies that advises governments, has difficulties in recruiting new members. I mean, it used to be an immense honor to be asked to sit on that council. People don't do it because they say, I have to publish. I can't do anything outside my research. So that's why this, that's part of what is important about this move in research assessment, that's valued again. It has to be valued. Our young researchers must not focus madly exclusively on it. They're part of society, their academic society, in their universities, and part of wider society. And I think we must enable them and encourage them to participate in that.
Hi, thank you very much. It's lovely to hear all that. I'm Nick from Science Foundation Ireland. I want to just talk about the narrative CV or DORA. I'm very pleased to see that this movement is going that way, and I certainly recognize its role in bringing about equality in terms of applications. But there is a very valid concern, I believe, that in our effort to bring about this equality, by removing these metrics, we may inadvertently disadvantage non-native English speakers.
Very interesting. Where shall I start? That is, okay. So in fact, let me go back. When I was first a panel member and then panel chair, in the very early days, I think the first advanced grant panels, the idea, there was a paragraph or there was a box you had to fill in with your leadership qualities. And interesting to know, it's important to know whether the applicant has any evidence that they can actually lead the project that they're proposing. And it was hilarious. I mean, there was some, endless chest-thumping blather, and then there were others who sort of very modestly said, well, I've been leading a research team for many years, and So that was dismissed because it did exactly that. It rewarded the wrong kind of attitude. And so then you go to the other end, metrics. So what we're doing now and what the narrative CVs are doing is to ask for evidence. So you can't just blather. So what we will be doing, and this is not really for public consumption, but I think we'll be getting there. So I feel in this circle, I feel comfortable saying it. What we'll be doing is to ask to list, evidence, which we all have. We all have evidence, whether it's monographs, whether it's, successful expedition or a book written, whatever. And then say in brief words, limited space, why that is important and what was important about it. And I think that does not require that great language skills. I mean, people who work in national law in Slovenia, who may be brilliant, may find it harder to write a good ERC application than you guys here with English as a native language. They are disadvantaged, and the panels do have to take that in account. Good language, good explanation matters. But I think, brilliant ideas and proposals shine through even bumpy language. But indeed, it will be important to keep the narrative to the point and supported by evidence.
If we were to move towards evidence-based, thank you, which I think is a very good idea, do you think down the line we might move closer and closer to listing our publications again because we're showing evidence.
Yeah, but the form will propose to list if you think your publications show that you've done good stuff, then show them. But don't show us 365 where you are the middle author and, just because it's in a high impact journal. Show us the one that you're proud of and that has moved. Mark gave a good example of a surgeon last night who published in a change in surgery in some doctor's magazine that's, not peer reviewed or anything. And he was proud of that because that led to the adoption. Of course, the underlying evidence was published in the Lancet and the British Medical Journal, whatever. But he listed that as the piece he was proud of. So I think the combination of a bit of evidence and a bit of explanation will make sure that people think about what they write. And in fact, as I said, Wellcome Trust and UKRI have introduced narrative. And when I first saw this, I thought I was going to die. I would just not apply if I had to write a page about myself. But those people who've started using it say they like it. And the panel members also like it. So, I'm very happy to experiment, which is, of course, as scientists, what we have to do. We have to experiment and we'll see how it works. So we'll monitor it.
Thanks very much. It was a very interesting presentation. I'm Annalisa, work for the Health Research Board, the main health research funder in Ireland. I was just curious to know how you define excellence. Especially in the context of this new research assessment. Yeah.
Well, defining excellence, you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and it says, excelling in what you do. So I think the current public debate has muddled this and has said, we want to include in excellence outreach and, sitting on panels and whatever else. I think that's a different dimension. We want excellence in scientific output, in communicating with society, in, being a good mentor. So it's a muddle. And scientific excellence is scientific excellence. It's a science you do. It's not whether you're good at talking to the public. And by the way, not everybody is good at talking to the public. So for me, we want to see scientific excellence, but we take other stuff into context. We can't expect young people to only do scientific excellence and then not sit on panels. So I think one provides the context for the other. And how it's measured, there's the usual, well, I know it when I see it. I also know that leads to biases. So there is an element of that. If you're blown away by a piece of science, then or findings research, you are, but you do have to make sure that that's not biased. And so I think that's the hardest thing there, to act against especially the unconscious biases.
Anthony Harvey, I'm the president of the Irish Federation of University Teachers. Thank you, Professor Leptin. That was a really inspiring talk and it covered so much ground. A few minutes ago, though, there was a question of the primacy of the English language, and I just wanted to draw attention and ask your opinion about an aspect of that. It is that in English, the word science has a much narrower term of reference than in other European languages, such as Wissenschaft, la science, Nauka, etc. When this academy was founded in 1785, it was well understood that human knowledge formed a sort of body and every part of it depended on every other part. Nowadays it has to be spelt out, as on that poster over there, experts in the sciences and humanities. And the problem is that when speaking English, when one talks about science, it tends to be assumed, at least in the world at large, that you're not talking about the humanities, you're not including the humanities. And I'm just wondering whether in some of the terminology of the European reports, such as the one you said is about to come out, in which science is mentioned all the time, scientific excellence, maybe scholarly excellence and scholarship would be a better term to use than science and scientific. just when you're speaking in the English language. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And I hope you've noticed that I make an effort to talk about research and not science, or to say science and humanities. And it is actually one of the most wonderful aspects of my new job, that I do get to hear the research from those fields that I didn't usually hear as a life scientist. And every time it says science in the documents that I see from staff at the ERC, I cross it out and write research. So thank you for your input, and the scholarship, scholarly work. Those are other terms. And I keep having. I'm from the German background, and I know that my fellow countrymen and women use this wrongly, and it's become deeply ingrained everywhere. I'll do my best. You have my promise. I have already done my best. Maybe not good enough to. No. But one has to be reminded constantly, and one has to point it out constantly. It's pernicious, because it is science that the politicians think. Science as a natural sciences and maybe social sciences and economic science, that is the only thing that matters. So I think you have a really important point, because it has impact on the way people think.
Thank you. Thanks, Professor Leptin, for a very inspirational presentation here.
Oh, there.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So my name is Eric Moore. I am the Vice Dean for Graduate Affairs at University College Cork. So I was delighted to kind of hear, your reference to, making research careers more attractive for the next generation of researchers and early stage career researchers. Because more often what happens is a lot of talented researchers, they kind of have to move, or they move towards industry because they feel pressure associated with assessment in terms of, trying to publish a lot and trying to accelerate their own careers quickly. Because, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on, how can you kind of prioritize or, provide kind of a more sustainable or clear career paths for these next generation of researchers?
Yes, very interesting. I mean, the idea that I will move to industry because I can't stand being assessed in the academic environment. Think that you will not be assessed in industry is, of course, naive. But that's one point. The other point is, it's not as if an academic career is the only attractive thing on earth. It's, just because we're at the top of that career doesn't mean that everybody else should want to. And I welcome the fact that young academics now see other opportunities out there and pursue them. We also have to remember that we put far more people into training of what used to be only the academic path than we used. No, put more people than we used to on the academic path without having more opportunities for them at the top. So we have to tell them at the beginning that we're training them, but not necessarily for an academic career. So I don't think it's so negative. I don't think we should see it as negative. It's really good if we have science administrators who have experience or research administrators who were trained in scholarly work, in all the skills and all the thinking that one needs and gets in an academic environment. So I don't even see it as negative. I mean, we weren't lazy in getting to the positions we have now. It is hard work. And that also needs to be clear.
I'm conscious of time, so last question or comment to Professor Bologna.
Thank you very much for your paper and your presentation. There are a point that I'd like to underline. I appreciate it very much. I do share the idea that impact is a very ambiguous term. In the S3 forum, the Strategic Forum for Research Infrastructure, we tried to adopt the category of fertility, that is less violent and more promising to medicine, but it was an epic failure. There was no way to get out of impact, and I'd like to submit it to you because probably it's something that could be done. The other point that I'd like to ask you to argument on is concerning the connection between excellence and responsibility. Because one could be very excellent and totally lacking responsibility toward their community, their fellow, the people he's mentoring, or it could be excellent and having, and so the number of people that are promoted, if I hire with an ERC grant 10 people and 10 years after, none of them as a stable position, there is something wrong, not in my research, in more my excellence in theory, but in my responsibility. The second point is concerning something that's been already raised concerning science. Because I do remember that Commissioner Moedas made a very clear distinction between research that is from money to knowledge and innovation that is from knowledge to money. And so sciences are the ones that are keeping both the aspect together and also some distinction between them, because if we make of this a circle, it would be a vicious circle. Thank you.
Very interesting. I think I'll only comment on the mentoring and other services. Yes, that is of course wanted, and the ERC asks the panels, is this researcher capable of carrying out the project? And it is in that context that this responsibility and mentoring comes in. My problem with that is, how do you measure it? Currently, applicants are asked how many PhDs and postdocs they've supervised during their career. Now, what are we supposed to do with that number? If somebody says 500, is that good? No, of course not. It can't be good, because they can't possibly have given 500 the attention that they would have needed if they'd been for good mentoring. So the number doesn't work. So then you say, well, how many are Harvard professors? Sure, you can ask that, or, professors or group leaders. How many? But that disadvantages those people who, if you are at Oxford or Cambridge or the Pasteur Institute or, at CERN, you just have it easier getting people who will go, because the pre-selection of people coming to you is higher. And, or if you have just a huge lot of people and let them learn to swim, the likelihood that somebody will do well. So it again favors criteria that we don't necessarily want to favor. And somebody who comes with a brilliant proposal from Krakow, well, that's actually a very prestigious university, bad example. But let's take, a small university, provincial, with a brilliant idea, but it's never the best people leave the country to go elsewhere. How do we judge? Do we punish that person because none of his or her group members have become big professors? So I just don't know how to measure it. It's very desirable to have good mentorship, good guidance, but I don't know how to measure it. And so if you can't measure it, you can't ask for it. It's unfortunate. It's highly desirable, but I have not heard any good. I have heard one good example from a Dutch university. What they do is they just look at the former grad students and postdocs and randomly choose 3 and ask them to comment. They ask former group members for references. And that is, of course, that works, because then you get views. But you can't do that. You can do that for a short list of a few candidates for, a faculty position. You can't do that for 1,000 grant applications a year, unfortunately.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Leptin. That brings us to the end of this session. I just want to thank you for your, first of all, coming here, which is excellent, and we're delighted to have you in the Academy, and for your excellent lecture, which we enjoyed, and the discussion, which I think has been extremely informative and useful. So thank you very much, and we hope very much that you'll come back more often in the future, because there's a lot of things that we want to talk about, and ongoing discussion will ensue. So our thanks to you for this.
Thank you to you too, and of course this is also, it's the island of Ireland, so we have Northern Ireland here, and I'm reminded that 1st of January is the 50th anniversary of the of Ireland joining Europe, and let's just please hope that the situation between the two houses of Ireland will get sorted out soon. I'm really just hoping for association of UK to Horizon Europe. But thank you for having me here. It was good fun and very interesting questions. And Sabine, my colleague here, has been taking notes of everything that's been said. So we will heed what we heard.
Thank you. And we now move to a panel discussion led by our Secretary for Polite Literature and Antiquities, Dan Carey, on enhancing research structures, funding policy, structural developments, performance and impact on the higher education research system. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you very much. Hello? Is this working? I don't think this is. Hello? Right? Getting any? There we are. Good. Yes, thank you very much, Gerry, and thank you to Rob and Emma for being here today. So Rob Kitchens, professor at Maynooth University, has held 2 ERC grants. One is current, in fact, so is in a great position to speak to us on this. Emma, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research at Queen's University Belfast, so you're bringing that perspective to it. There's so many questions that we could cover. What we're going to do is just start with a few remarks from you, and then we'll kind of move to a more open discussion and hopefully a chance for people from the floor to make contributions. Maybe Rob, you might want to begin with a few comments. We have so many areas that are coming under the question of research in this domain, but yeah, fire away.
Right, okay, thanks very much for the invitation to speak. So I kind of want to start by saying we've been having a lot of these conversations for a really long time at this stage. And the primary move that I'd like to see in the Irish system is a move from aspiration to action and implementation. And instead of having these go-round conversations every couple of years, that we actually start to implement things. So in some cases we have policy, in some cases we have pilot initiatives, in some cases we have programs that last for 5 years and then disappear. They're patchy, and like many government policies, only partially or not at all implemented. And so that's where we really need to go. So I'll move on to my other points, but all of them, I think, actually need to move towards implementation. And what I'm going to say has been said multiple times over already, because we already kind of know what some of the issues in the system is. So the first one is really a need for a diverse funding policy. So it's individual and team awards. It's a ladder from PhD all the way up to advanced PI. It's all disciplines. If we're going to have research priorities, and I think there is a real if question there, then that needs serious reflection. I think it's notable and it's regrettable that we don't have equivalent to SFI centres, for example, for societal and economic challenges, such as housing, demographics, economic development, education, mobility, migration, infrastructure and services, heritage, arts and culture, and so on. All the stuff of everyday life, as opposed to just narrow areas of particular parts of science that are aligned to particular industries who have interests in investing in Ireland. And we need to fund the research infrastructure. So we need to fund on a consistent basis everyday and specialist equipment, data infrastructures, particularly around open science, open data initiatives. We need to fund the buildings, we need to fund the networking, we need to fund the technical support staff, and so on. And we need long-term multi-annual investment, not these one-off 5-year, 2-year, 3-year pilot schemes. And then, oh, by the way, can you please be sustainable on that? It doesn't provide long-term stability where you can invest your resources as an institution around them. You don't know whether things are going to be there. So we put a lot of effort and money into graduate schools through PRTLI and so on, across all disciplines and areas, and then they disappeared. I know we still have some of them in the SFI domain. We had SIF money in that domain. There's a very big danger we'll go that way with the laureate awards as well. We don't have that on a long-term footing. And we need competitive salaries and working conditions for researchers. The legacies, Haddington Road and so on, are actually stifling our international competitiveness. to recruit staff into the system. We all know this. We all know it needs to change. We hear from government who say, yes, we can hear you, we're listening to you, and then don't change anything. Okay? So that's how I'm kind of saying things have to kind of move that way. We fought a really long battle around PhD stipends. PhD stipends didn't go up from 2006 to 2021 or something. It wasn't a living wage. It's still not a living salary. It's still not a living stipend. There's a lot more needs to happen there. Postdoc salaries, not competitive. Employment conditions, things like you have to appoint on point 1 of a salary scale, regardless of any previous international postdoc experience and so on. All that nonsense has to go. And we need to be able to support long-term research careers. Now, I'm very much talking in the Irish system, but all of this stuff goes across everywhere, into other systems. And then I have one suggestion which I'd like to see as my own kind of thing. I would like to see all government public sector research. So at the minute, every government department has its own research bit, and they can kind of put out tenders and so on. I'd like that all brought under the aegis of one organisation where you can get efficiencies around how that's assessed, the reach in terms of numbers who might apply for it. You'd increase the number of applications, you'd increase the pool of expertise that are actually advising those departments, and you get a lot more efficiencies around how you would organise and deliver that research.
Thank you. Thanks, Rob, very much. That's very helpful. Yeah, Emma, if I could turn to you for some opening thoughts.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you very much for the invitation. I was a late entry. For those of you who are in the audience who are eagle-eyed, you'll notice that I'm not Geraldine Meany because I hear that she's poorly, so I've come in at the last moment. So absolutely beautiful place to be here, and I will say on a really interesting topic, which we are all talking about. This is obviously a point of change and a time of change. So I can talk about the UK context. We've had the grant review, we've got the nurse review ongoing, we've just had the results of the TICL review. I mean, we know there needs to be changes, and I think there is a consensus. So I'm going to repeat a lot, I think, of what Maria and other panel members have said today. So I'll start off by saying that at Queen's, we've just rewritten our strategy, and we have a new research and innovation roadmap and action plan about how we're doing. We're a year into that, and we're doing exceptionally well. So for whatever the research excellence framework measures, I will say that we've just done incredibly well in the last exercise. We're first in the UK for agriculture, fisheries and veterinary sciences. We're fourth in the UK for health and biosciences. And we're eighth in the UK for law as well. 99% of our environment is world leading or internationally excellent. Now, our REF exercise results is a byproduct of our strategy. We focus on our strategy, and what we then submit to the Research Excellence Framework falls out from that strategy. And we've absolutely, on our strategy, reflected on what we have internally and what the external horizon is going to look like. So we focused on people, we focused on partnerships, and we focused on excellence. And those are the horizons and the kind of key themes that we work upon. How that then falls out into the impact that we have within the world, whether it's a disciplinary impact, a social impact, an environmental impact, that all comes from our investments into these things. We're incredibly lucky because we have had an awful lot of investment over the last few years, and we're in the middle of the Belfast Region City Deal, which is £1 billion investment into the Belfast region, with 300 million of that coming to innovation projects. And that is about us exploiting our research excellence into inclusive economic development. And this involves multiple agencies all coming together to work together. The councils, the industry, local civic groups, investment agencies who invest in Northern Ireland, all coming and working to exploit the investment of £1 billion into this region. So we're in a really lucky place to have had that happen. Now, I sat down this morning over breakfast and I reflected on the theme of this particular panel discussion. And I've come up with 5 things that I would like to see. First of all, unsurprisingly, is a sustainable model. It's absolutely not escaped my attention that while I'm sitting here, there are colleagues of mine who are on the picket line striking for a better funding model within the UK. And I think everybody accepts, the VCs, the executive teams, the PhD students, that things need to change. It is not a sustainable model that we have. And we cannot support and invest in our staff. And I mean staff, both academic and not academic, in the way that we would like to in the current structures. We need long-term investment. We need to be able to plan for 5 years and not have a fear that a level of investment is going to decrease. We need to also think about what we stop doing. If we don't have an increase in investment, we cannot, as universities, do everything that we wish that other people wish us to do. So what is it that we need to stop if we're going to stop something? The second thing in my wish list is an investment in people. And I absolutely mean the professional support staff, the clerical staff, the technicians, the PhD students, the postdocs. And we are thinking about, and we put interventions in place around this. We have a postdoc development center, which is designed to help people, young early career staff, think about not just academia, but industry or public policy or different sectors that they can then move into. And how can we help them do that? We need to make sure that the places that we work are attractive places. We're in an ecosystem. How do we want people from around the world to want to come and work in Belfast, to want to come and work in Dublin or Cork or wherever it is? But we need to have policies that attract people and not put people off. And that includes international students, which I know if you've looked at the UK press, it's all over the front pages today about visas. We need to retain our talent, and that links into the investment that we're putting into this. The third thing is partnerships. There is absolutely no way that we can sit in an ivory tower and expect to be excellent. How do we link up with other universities and academics around the world? And that includes association with the EU. How do we link up to industries, whether they are local or whether or not they are international? How do we listen to community groups to find out what they need from us? It's only through partnerships, through that symbiotic relationship of what we can do at cutting edge science to find out about what people need or what questions interest people. It doesn't have to be impactful. It could just be discovery and curiosity driven. And I think there's a place in partnerships that's about the local place. What is special about the local place and what makes it distinct, as well as linking up globally, nationally, or even regionally? What is it that we need to do to have systems in place that takes local excellence and moves it into the global? The fourth thing, and I'll be very quick now because I know I'm running out of time, is inclusion. Now, we have a whole panel that's on inclusion later on today. There are many problems in the world, or many questions in the world, that are really complex, and they are not the domain of one particular demographic. We need to have very clever people with different demographics around the table to solve the world problems. And so that means we want to see a diverse set of people in the ERC funding, in the innovation funding, in the UKRI funding, and we're not seeing that in the way that I would like to see. So how do we get more diverse voices around the table? And finally, all of this is underpinned by excellence. I don't have a problem with impact. I don't have a problem with how we define excellence. We just need to strive for both. And what we need to do is take the excellence that we have and be able to, where it's appropriate, exploit it to the benefit of the world. The final thing that I will say is my 5 points is that we need to do this in a way which is efficient. We need to not have burdensome bureaucratic processes that mean that academics and researchers cannot be academics and researchers because they become form fillers and administrators. So we need to think about how we can achieve all of this in a way which trusts our universities, trusts our academics to just do what they need to do in a way that they can do it well.
Thank you both very much. That was terrific. Emma, I wanted to follow up on a couple of things drawing on your expertise based in Northern Ireland. One is to think about the North-South relationship, and that's been nourished, of course, by the grants that were made available by the HEA, and Queen's did extremely well in that. We're a very important partner for all sorts of institutions in the Republic. But it almost speaks to Rob's point about these one-offs. And there may be a second round, but is there likely to be anything beyond that? How, as a matter of utter priority for so many reasons, do we continue to nourish that relationship independent of what happens to these other larger questions about association?
So, I mean, I have to thank so many people who, when I first arrived at my job, it's about 4 years ago, my boss told me that one of my priorities was to improve the research collaboration with our colleagues within universities and technical colleges within the Republic of Ireland. And I will say I've had such a warm welcome. It's one of the nicest things about my role. It's been absolutely lovely. With things such as the Royal Irish Academy and the British Irish Chamber of Commerce being absolutely key stakeholders in understanding the power that there is in this place, and the fact that partnership and joining up together, whether it's academia or academia and industry or academia and civic and community groups, there's a real power and to be able to address those questions that we have on this island about food security, about sustainability, about integrating our health systems to improve the health of our population. So it's absolutely essential. I think what's nice about it is, as much, I do believe politically that there is a desire to see this continue. We know that there's currently the call that was announced, I think, yesterday or the day before, which is in food security and sustainability. I believe there's been an announcement for next year. There's going to be another one on health. I think there's so much more that can be achieved with this. You know, we are next to each other. The pandemic showed that, you know, a border doesn't stop viruses from spreading. A border doesn't stop energy from being able to be used. Sustainability issues. So we need to work together more than ever to address those questions. So I believe that there's an absolute political will. And I think what's nice about the current calls is we are seeing an evolution. The HEA call, which was fantastic, and it was lovely to see the work that was, and the variety of work that was supported in that, has now evolved into a UK island call. And now, so who next? Who next can we invite into this really exciting space to help us solve some of our problems?
Thanks. Rob, I wanted to ask you a question about, and you alluded to this in your remarks about the need for, in effect, SFI centers that would be wider, and you listed so many powerful topics that we could be exploring. So how to put the question slightly differently, how do we expand our imagination so that we're not just thinking about industry when we think about partnerships? The work that you've done is so relevant in this context.
Yeah, so I mean, this is obviously coming out of the policy that followed immediately after the crisis, where we decided we would have research priorities linked onto science that was linked to industry. And that obviously had big consequences for science, not just for the social sciences and the humanities. So there were areas that dropped out of the priorities on the sciences. And so it's about, you know, we have to keep the fundamental in the frame as well as the applied. And obviously I listed a whole series of applied things, but I do find it fascinating that we have all of these major problems around things like, you know, housing or issues around migration and mobility, or around planning or infrastructure and so on, and we invest practically no research in it. So it's about trying to, you know, it's about recognizing that there's huge societal benefit about understanding the society in which we live in, and thinking around the social policies as to how we address those issues. Whereas what we really do is, in relation to housing, for example, is we let vested interests drive the agenda, as opposed to having a really good knowledge base about what's going on, and a diverse set of voices that actually explain what's happening within all the various aspects related around housing. So, you know, and we gave that priority to one agency to do, you know, and that obviously, given their remit, was going to create a certain kind of thing. But if we're serious about this notion of addressing societal challenges, then we have to address the society bit of it, you know, and not also think that science will actually solve some of those societal challenges. You know, they're fundamental questions around, you know, kind of people and systems and so on, and you're not going to solve it with a bit of technology. You know, it's full of politics, and it's full of messiness and wicked issues, and an app isn't going to solve it, you know, or a bit of kit isn't going to solve it.
That surely is one of the lessons of COVID as well, of which there are many, of course, but I think you've commented very thoughtfully on that question of the technological solutionism dimension.
The disaster is that we should be on PRTLI 10 or 11 or 12, and that would have actually kept the funding in that space and started to address them. And also the thing is that we didn't join up with government. So that was my last point about trying to maybe have an organisation that would organise the link, a formal link between the universities and the research sector, about actually doing the research for government.
Yeah, no, it's an important point, and obviously there's a strong commitment to research for policy within Impact 2030. It's a major commitment that the Irish Research Council and the RIA in collaboration have been working on. So we need creative structures in which to move out of certain acquired or inherited behavior, if you like, and go to solutions and consultancies and so forth. Emma, I wonder if I could ask you, because as you may be aware, there's an amalgamation on the horizon of IRC and SFI to create a new research funding agency. So do you have any wisdom for us based on the UKRI experience? Any things we should embrace or turn away from?
Well, I think UKRI is still evolving. And I think, and that was part of the grant review, was to look at what the structure was like and where it has succeeded. I mean, you need to take people with you. You need to make sure that each of the individual entities, and for us, it's a variety of research councils, understand what the value is of having an umbrella oversight for your funding structure. And I mean, and they're enormous, because it's, sustainability will touch every research council. Health will touch every research council. So equality, diversity and inclusion will touch every research council. So the idea that they are siloed and that they are separately trying to solve some of these problems is a little unhelpful. So, but yet having done that, it's, when money is involved, people begin to pull their drawbridges up. And so it can be very, very challenging. So I think it's about structuring it in such a way where it's not a zero-sum game, that there is new money on the table or rediversion of funds to be able to work collaboratively. And I think we're seeing this in REF, and we're seeing this in the funding councils as well, that disciplinary boundaries are beginning to be more fluid, or they always have been more fluid, but we are recognizing the fluidity of this. That's not to say it's important for those who are pure disciplinary scholars to continue to be pure disciplinary scholars, but there are many at the edge, and I'll use myself as an example. I'm a developmental and comparative psychologist. I work with children and chimpanzees, but I also work with philosophers and biologists and historians and statisticians and anthropologists. And so my area is about culture, and culture covers everything. So I think it's about seeing why and telling exactly the story of why this needs to happen, and then making sure that there are rewards through the funding structures, through the efficiency savings, to show how this can work more effectively. And I think we've seen a focus on academic scholars, and actually we've also got to remember that with Innovate UK, within the UK, there are industry scholars within this as well, R&D experts. So how do we bring them into the fold and have a kind of really multi-agency approach to solving some of these problems?
Thank you very much. It takes us on to the questions of missions and grand challenges and other things that would take us all day to discover. There's an opportunity for some questions from the floor or comments that people might to make. Martin, yeah. There's a mic coming. Yep.
Yeah, I'd just like to make the point that, training in research is very important, but the people who are trained in research, it goes far beyond academia. There are many organizations, walks of life, where an ability either to research yourself or to appreciate or assess the research of others is vital. And some of us who liked doing should we say, more academic research. When we're retired, we can always go back to that. But I think it's one needs to recognize that people who are involved in research, it's not a failure if they don't go into academia. There are many applications that they can use throughout their working life. And so I think one needs to think of oneself is that research is not just training people for academia, or indeed for fairly narrow industrial or health projects or whatever, but it's also of much broader social and natural importance. And I suppose one thing, now I hope I am out of date on this, but in an Irish context, I felt in my time in the public service that there was insufficient contact between administration and the academic community and academic bodies. I mean, that's one of the things that, in particular in the United States, they're very good at. And I hope that we're on an improving trajectory on that, both north and south of the border.
Thank you very much. Actually, you raised a couple of very, very important points there. Just to pick up really on the question about research, I think everyone now conducts research, partly through the availability of the internet. And I think we don't understand that symbiotic relationship, that we're all doing research at the moment, which was actually more difficult to do when it was library-based, in which we had to rely on specialists. And some of it has its more trivial and routine dimensions. But actually, we should probably embrace that and see that we're part of an ecology, in effect. But also to pick up on your last point as well, I think that it really is the invitation that we have now to try to make a more integrated set of relationships and to provide our expertise. I think the will and the aspiration is there. We have to create the kind of structures and mechanisms in which we do it, and the trust relationships that will foster that in the future. I'm conscious of time and that there's a coffee break awaiting. We should probably end here, and to thank our two speakers, Emma and Rob, very much.